As all of you probably know, in 1994, the City of St. Paul entered into a process of police civilian review of allegations of misconduct by police officers in the City of St. Paul. While other cities were doing this by court order, having been sued to start that process, the City of St. Paul undertook that process voluntarily. Subsequent to that event 22 years ago, the formation of the Civilian Review Authority, in 2001, some tweaks to that review authority were made in accordance with an agreement between the police department and our local branch of the NAACP. Made some changes in terms of data keeping, made some changes in terms of community processes and where you could file a complaint, and some other changes to it. In 2009, in a general audit of the police department by the Berkshire group, made some recommended changes to the Civilian Review Authority as well. The primary purpose of that report was not dealing with the Civilian Review Authority. It was really dealing more with the general operations of the police department, and that was where the focus of our work was after that. However, in the context of both events locally and across the country, increasingly members of our community came to my office, I think spoke with other council members and others, to say that they were lacking confidence in the Police Civilian Internal Affairs Review Committee. They didn't have full confidence that the complaints that were made to that committee were being heard properly, deliberated properly, and investigated properly. Based on those concerns that were raised by the community, we did commence another audit that was done by the University of Minnesota, and they made recommended changes as well. I'm mindful of the fact that the original intent in 1994, when we first started this committee, was, and I'm going to quote directly from the audit, which I think quotes from the original formation of the Civilian Review Authority. They wanted to ensure that complaints against police officers were dealt fairly with due regard for both officers and citizens equally. As we set out to make changes to this, or make recommended changes that the council will take up, we wanted to make sure that we maintain that balance, that we treated officers and civilians and citizens equally in this process. We need to have a process that has the confidence of both our community members and our police officers. I think that the recommended changes that City Attorney Clark will go through in just a minute strike that right balance between the confidence of the community in the changes that we make that will give them full faith in the civilian review process, but do so in a way that also keeps the interests of the officers in mind, that has the perspective of an officer as the Civilian Review Authority discusses an allegation of misconduct on the part of a police officer. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our city attorney, and then we'll hear from Council President Stark, and then we'll take some questions.
Thank you, Mayor. I should first thank the mayor for this is one of the first tasks he handed to me when I became city attorney.
You're welcome.
And no, I mean that because working on these issues is vitally important, and it's something that animates me. It's some of the more rewarding work I do as city attorney. So I wanted to pick up on a thread that the mayor mentioned about balance. You'll see in the draft ordinance that we've recommended, it takes a balanced approach, and I think a balanced approach is a credible one when it comes to these questions of police-community relationships. I don't view the police and the community as sort of oppositional or necessarily oppositional, and a lot of these changes are meant are in keeping with that thought. I should also mention what we've been up to since the last time I was in front of cameras last October, when we announced the audit, their audit findings. We held a series of community conversations after that that involved hundreds of people from throughout the city of St. Paul who came and voiced their opinions on the different parts of the audit recommendations. We compiled all of those votes, all of the people's preferences. And then I had, along with various members of my office, a series of one-on-one targeted meetings with different stakeholders throughout the system. Community members as well as representatives of the police department, police federation, and council members. And all of that led to an appearance in April was the last time I spoke publicly about our process in front of the council. And at that appearance, I mentioned we were going to be forming a task force within the city to really get down to where we're at today. So that task force was made up of members of the Human Rights and Equal Economic Opportunity Department here in the city, with the leadership of Jesse Kingston. There was representation from the police department, then Assistant Chief Axtell, now our current chief. Since he became chief, Assistant Chief Kathy Warren has been a big part of this. And then members from my office, including Laura Peaton, who's the deputy in the criminal division. And we met just about weekly throughout the summer, working through a lot of the nitty-gritty details about what some of these changes would look like. And I should say the ordinance is just one part. It's just one important part, but one part of a bigger whole. And that whole being increasing the credibility of how we deal with complaints of police misconduct in the city of St. Paul. So I wanted to walk through some of the most important recommendations, at least as I see them. Some of the changes you'll see in the draft ordinance underlined are the additions and strike through, obviously, the subtractions or proposed subtractions. First, I think it was important, we heard from community members, some of the leadership of the African American Leadership Council and the NAACP, for the city to recognize that we did go through some of this, as the mayor mentioned, in 2001. And what I mean by that is there were conversations about different potential changes, not necessarily to the PCIARC process, but to strengthen our community partnerships with police officers and the police department. So you'll notice right off the bat there's an acknowledgement that we're building upon that agreement from 2001. Throughout the ordinance as well, one of the two main pillars of the changes on the table are removing the PCIARC physically and through institutional control from the police department and sliding it over under control of the Human Rights and Equal Economic Office, the HERO office. That's been a crucial priority of the community. And it's one that I think, again, goes to credibility from the community's perspective. Community members voiced concerns that the PCIARC was just an extension of the police department, and that there was a credibility gap in some of the outcomes coming out of PCIARC. You'll notice as well one of the two big changes that I mentioned. The second one would be the composition of the board itself, or the commission. We propose increasing the number of civilians on the commission. That was an important priority of the community that we heard loud and clear. We've also proposed specifying the current ordinance as it reads is there are two federation members, two police union members who are members of the commission. The proposal, after, like I mentioned, months and hundreds of conversations, is to narrow that pool to commanders. So commanders are still members of the federation, but commanders being, again, striking the balance, members of the police department who have experience with maintaining discipline, also more experience working with members of the public, and who might be better able to speak to some of the sort of our intent to increase the credibility of outcomes here. And then I should mention one of the, actually it was the most important priority from the many different community conversations that we had was to stop the practice of internal affairs, including in their recommendations, or excuse me, including recommendations in their reports to the PCIARC. If you'll notice in the little handout prepared for everyone, the PCIARC is one part of the internal process. It starts in internal affairs. It heads to PCIARC, where there's a civilian review component, but then it ends with the chief, and that's an important point I don't want lost here, is that there's no proposal on the table to take away what is required by state law, which is that the police chief is the final say on discipline. But one of the most important, or the biggest priority was to increase to take away the internal affairs recommendation, and that's included, you'll see in the draft ordinance. And then finally, I would mention, and then I'll hand it over to Russ here, is there's been a concern voiced strongly through the community that there's a barrier to entry for people to become members of the commission, for the civilian members. And so you'll notice maybe a subtle change, but I think a very important one, is to allow people to go through the required training after they've been appointed, not before. I mean, before, as it currently stands, people go through the training and then they still don't know if they can become appointed to the commission. And then finally, I lied to you. One final point is making sure that our training for the members of the commission includes things like racial equity and cultural competence, implicit bias, these concepts that police officers are trained on, but it's something that I think we can strengthen, and strengthen's one of the key words for me today. I don't view this as a radical overhaul, nor do I think a radical overhaul was warranted. But 20 plus years of a system means 20 plus years of changes in how police do their jobs. It means the advent of the internet since then, so allowing people to make electronic complaints, things like that. It was time for us to make some changes. And I'm just really excited to see where this goes from here. But with that, I will hand it over to Council President Stark.
Thank you. I just want to thank the mayor and city attorney for the work that's been put into this over the last couple of years, reviewing our existing ordinance and talking to, as Mr. Clark said, hundreds of community members, different organizations, to get their feedback about this important piece of city policy. And to say that as they are now handing the process over to the council, the first reading of this set of ordinance changes will come into council tomorrow. We'll have a public hearing on this 2 weeks from tomorrow, November 16th. We encourage people to continue to provide that important feedback about what they think about these proposed changes during that period of time. And then the council would potentially act to vote on this November 23rd, or it could be later than that. And I think these conversations have been very important. I do think that balance is important, and critically important in this moment in time is to make sure that our public and our officers have confidence in the process that we've set up, that we're going to have a civilian component to our internal review process. I think was a very progressive thing 20 years ago. It's becoming increasingly common. It was really time to go and look and make sure that our practices were up to snuff given kind of current standards out there. And very healthy debates can be had about exactly what those details should be. I think that what's in front of us is a big improvement over what our process was before, even though we had a very good process. I look forward to that further feedback and to making some ordinance changes here in the near future. Thank you.
Then we'll take some questions.
I have a question, Sam. If a person's been convicted of a crime, even a felony, are they still eligible to sit as a civilian member of the commission?
Currently, no. And so this is an important point. I mean, this ordinance, like I mentioned, is one part. That group I mentioned earlier has been meeting weekly for months now. working out some of those more difficult implementation questions. A lot of it is we can't get to the real answer of what that would look like in the future until we get an ordinance in place. But there has been no discussion about including people who've been convicted of felonies. I think there's a lot of reasons for that, and that's not on the table right now.
Any other questions?
Thank you all.
Thank you.